The NSA is conducting satellite scans in search of terrorist Lucas Wade, with Chief Analyst Bob overseeing the operation. Meanwhile, at Camp Black Horse in Afghanistan, psychiatrist and Captain Jane Lee is on a Skype call with her daughter Samantha, who is spending the Christmas holidays in the United States with her other mother, Beth. Samantha recites Jane's ternary countdown for her upcoming 2-week leave. Realizing the time, Jane prepares to leave when a soldier named Adams arrives and hands her a Christmas card. Overcome with emotion, Adams breaks into tears. Though she is running late for her transport, Jane chooses to sit down and talk with him. After finishing her conversation, Jane heads out, only to be approached by NSA agent Whitney Smith. Whitney offers her a ride to the transport, and Jane accepts. During the drive, Jane speaks warmly about her daughter. Eventually, Whitney reveals that she needs Jane to come with her, reassuring her that she isn't in any trouble. Jane firmly states that she has gone 18 months without leave and refuses to miss Christmas with her family. Despite her objections, Whitney soon has her on a plane bound for Black Site Indigo. Upon arrival, they are met by Director Stevens, who escorts Jane through the facility. Stevens explains that while the NSA possesses vast amounts of intelligence, they still require a human mind to interpret and process the data effectively. Jane, she explains, has been brought in to provide therapeutic support for those tasked with that burden. Stevens leads Jane to the central processing area, where she is introduced to Bob, a massive, pulsating mass of human brain tissue equipped with a single camera eye. Bob greets Jane, revealing he already knows all about her, and introduces himself as the Chief Intelligence Officer. Chris, the lead technician, explains that the NSA cultivated a nutrient-enriched mass of organic tissue and implanted a mind within it to process the overwhelming flood of intelligence data. Bob, claiming he knows everything, says he already understands why Jane is there and insists he doesn't need a therapist. Jane, however, calmly asserts that their conversations could help him manage his difficulties and, in turn, aid in locating Lucas. But the moment Lucas's name is mentioned, Bob visibly struggles. His voice distorts, he hesitates, and he begins to complain of pain, showing signs of cognitive distress. Disturbed by the sight of the massive organic brain, Jane rushes out and vomits. Outside, Director Stevens approaches her and firmly states that it's time to begin her work. Inside, Chris shows Jane a video of Lucas detonating a Christmas tree, and Stevens explains that while they know he's planning an attack, the time and location remain unknown. Physically, Bob appears to be functioning normally, leading them to believe that the issue affecting him is psychological in nature. Stevens admits they have no legal authority to detain Jane, but she points out that Jane is the only Army therapist who has voluntarily extended her tour 3 times. Stevens believes Jane simply can't walk away from a soldier in pain. Chris adds that unlike others, Bob doesn't have the option of taking leave. Stevens then emphasizes the urgency, stating that Bob is suffering and needs Jane's help, and if she can't reach him, countless mothers and fathers could die. Faced with the weight of that responsibility, Jane reluctantly agrees. She then makes a Skype call to Beth and Samantha. Neither Beth nor Samantha take the news well. Samantha, visibly upset, runs off, and Beth, holding back emotion, tells Jane to be there for the ones who truly need her, not them. She ends the call abruptly. Moments later, Bob calls Jane to apologize for his earlier behavior, but she cuts him off, not in the mood for pleasantries. Soon after, Bob initiates contact, questioning the point of wasting time with her and expressing doubt about how talking to a therapist will do him any good. Bob suddenly appears on the TV screen, prompting Jane to complain about the invasion of her privacy. She turns off the TV and firmly tells Bob to leave her alone. Moments later, a drone approaches the window, and Bob speaks through it, declaring that he doesn't want Jane around. Jane recognizes this as a cry for help, but instead of opening up, Bob accidentally activates the sprinkler in her room and locks the door, avoiding any real conversation about his struggles. The next day, after drying her clothes, Jane finally approaches Bob to talk. She explains that she was attempting to sneak a cigarette in her room, which accidentally triggered the sprinklers. Bob is taken aback that she's covering for him. Stevens then clears the room, leaving them alone, and Jane begins by saying they clearly got off on the wrong foot. Bob questions whether Jane can truly help him, comparing her to an earthworm in his world. Jane acknowledges the analogy but insists she'd rather try than not, requesting 2 hours to work with him. She promises that if, after that time, Bob still refuses to engage, she will respect his decision. Bob agrees, but deducts the time she was late from the allotted period. Jane accepts and begins to explain how he sees the world. Jane's initial approach fails to make an impact. She then shifts to word association before having Bob recount how Lucas vanished from a subway a month ago, and how he has been unable to locate him since. When Jane inquires about how that made Bob feel, he offers a hollow and unconvincing description of his emotions. Eager to move past the topic, Bob signals he wants to continue, prompting Jane to ask what he would wish for. Bob describes a man named Herb Hillman, who is building something for his wife. He wishes that Jane would call Herb and asks what Herb is making. Before Jane can respond, Bob interrupts to report he has spotted a suspect. Stevens orders Bob to deploy a drone missile to eliminate the target, and Bob notes that 3 non-combatants were also killed in the strike. Jane finally suggests that Bob is experiencing psychosomatic blindness related to Lucas. She emphasizes that Bob must be under immense stress and reminds him that he is still, at his core, a person. Bob, feeling uneasy, attempts to cut the conversation short. When Jane presses him on how it felt to kill the suspect, Bob responds by saying that Jane bothers him. Bob swiftly regains his composure and brings up a video of Samantha and Beth, asserting that they are doing fine without Jane. He tells Jane that she needs to feel needed and expresses pity for her before declaring that her time is up. Jane counters by explaining that pity stems from empathy and compassion, concluding that Bob, beneath it all, does care deeply for people. Jane asks Bob what it's like to pity 7 billion people. In response, Bob shows her video footage of Lucas eating a donut on the subway. He then plays clips of people around Lucas, including a girl being told by her sister that Santa Claus doesn't exist. Bob expands the footage to reveal the widespread misery across the world, admitting to Jane that he has been crying ever since they activated him. The footage shows Lucas leaving the subway as Bob attempts to track him electronically. The image flickers intermittently, prompting Stevens and Chris to rush back into the room. After a tense moment, Bob informs them that they are too late. On the subway train, Lucas plants a present containing a bomb. A man discovers the package and asks if anyone left it. Then the bomb detonates. Reports flood into Bob, who integrates updates on Lucas with information about the people trapped and killed by the explosion. Eventually, Bob loses all trace of Lucas and apologizes for the failure. Disgusted, Stevens storms out, while Jane steps aside to get some tea. When Stevens returns, Jane expresses confidence that they can still find Lucas, but Stevens coldly informs her that she's been dismissed. Jane inquires about Bob's fate, but Stevens dismisses him as no longer Jane's concern. She reveals that the Joint Chiefs have ordered Bob's deactivation. Jane protests, calling it murder, but Stevens coldly responds that they will simply grow another Bob, and another when that one fails. She reminds Jane that it is Christmas Eve and advises her to go home. As Chris initiates Bob's shutdown, Jane packs her belongings while turning off a newscast showing mourners for the subway explosion. Chris then arrives, informing her that Bob wants to speak with her. Jane enters the processing room where Bob explains that he can only hear her now, and asks if she is his friend. Overwhelmed with emotion, Jane tearfully tells him that she is. Jane admits that Bob was right. She needs to feel needed by others. She reflects that now people are dying, Bob is dying, and she hasn't been useful to any of them. Bob calls her closer, and she embraces him. He reassures her that she isn't useless. She's human. Jane promises to stay with him and asks once more what his one wish would be. Bob reveals that his wish is for there to truly be a Santa Claus. Later, at the base Christmas party, Jane approaches Chris and demands that he reactivate Bob. When Chris explains that he cannot, Jane declares that she has spent her entire life caring for dying soldiers and vows to do everything in her power to save Bob. Jane reminds Chris that Bob is his soldier, and that Chris brought her in specifically to help him, prompting Chris to agree. She tells him they are going to make Santa Claus real. Together, Chris and Jane head to the processing room as alarms begin to sound. Bob warns Jane not to proceed, cautioning that it won't save her, but Jane replies that the whole point is peace on Earth and goodwill toward men. Bob comes back online and sees Herb telling his wife that he is building a pillar, with her as the pillar in his life. Bob warns Jane and Chris that they will go to jail and that he is going to die, questioning why they took such a risk. He then realizes he is no longer an NSA asset and that nothing holds him back. Jane tells Chris that Bob has finally gotten his wish. At a shipping warehouse, an order is received and drones launch, carrying over 400,000 presents. They deliver the gifts down chimneys worldwide, while Bob simultaneously pays off tens of thousands of loans. A stocking drops into Lucas's hideout, but when he opens it, he finds a piece of coal. At that moment, FBI agents storm in. Stevens storms into the room, demanding an explanation. Chris warns her that Bob now controls the entire system. Bob calmly announces that he is spreading $200 billion in Christmas cheer, assuring Stevens that he has fixed the economy. As a final gesture, he reveals he has delivered Lucas to the FBI, directly to Stevens' satisfaction. Bob insists that Jane and Chris face no repercussions for their actions, emphasizing that he controls the nuclear arsenal. He then orders a large supply of eggnog. Later, everyone gathers in the processing room to celebrate. Chris embraces Bob, and Jane shares a hesitant hug with Stevens. Stevens then informs Bob that Jane and Chris have received full presidential pardons. Stevens warns Bob that the government will inevitably shut them down and asks if it was worth it. Bob replies that for one night, Santa Claus was real. Later, Whitney drives Jane home and hands her the phone. It's Bob, who explains that he told them to take Jane before she could say goodbye so she wouldn't be late. Jane suddenly realizes where she is. Bob says his final goodbye. When Jane arrives, Beth answers the door and finds her there. Samantha runs to hug Jane, and after a brief moment, Beth and Jane embrace as well. Please like and subscribe the channel for more videos like these.